My, with an introduction like that, good Sabbath. I wanted to start the discussion today about our 275th anniversary with a couple of points. When I first brought this up at a business meeting, I didn't think I'd wind up here necessarily, but I've learned a lot about our church, a lot about our legacy. I'd like to share a little of that with you. First thing I did when I started researching is I wondered what you call a 275th anniversary. So I went to the computer because that has all the answers. The best answer I found was 275th anniversary is a way long time to be married. And that was about the only answer I got. So, why do we do this? Why are we looking back? Those of you that remember Florence Bowden, she was a part of this church for over 100 years. She died in 2005 at the age of 105 and was instrumental in the 1900s, the growth of this church. She wrote the dedication to our 250th anniversary history book, and I want to read just one little paragraph that maybe sums up why we're here today doing this. In the life of a church such as ours, it seems appropriate to consider those lessons from the past at least every generation. It is good to plan for such review every 25 years or so. So when I read that, I thought, well, maybe we're doing the right thing. So I have a PowerPoint presentation, kind of show a few things. I want to start off right away and thank our historians, the assistants, and our pastor for putting this together, because if this goes really sour, I don't want you to sleep at the end when I thank them. So, all right. In the beginning, actually, 1685, which if you add up is not 275 years ago, but there was a group from Massachusetts, Swansea, Massachusetts, that were persecuted for their beliefs and came to the area, including Robert Ayres, who brought his family and his Seventh-day beliefs. In the 1680s, there followed additional families of both First-day and Seventh-day believers. Reverend Timothy Brooks was a Sabbath keeper, and he sort of led both groups. By the late 1600s, they had built a log cabin for worship, and they shared that with the First-day Baptists. Wasn't a lot of choice around here. You had one, you stuck with it, and they shared it. They met in Bowentown, and that monument is actually along the side of the road. If you ever go along the road, Greenwich Road, you can stop and see that monument. So, from there, 1705, Robert Ayres purchases what became Shiloh, but it was known as Cohansey Corners. We went through growing pains, and in 1710, Reverend Timothy Brooks left to become the pastor of the First-day Baptist at Cohansey. The Sabbath keepers here were disheartened but continued on, and what they needed was a pastor to lead them. Enter Jonathan Davis, and we'll remember that name. Jonathan Davis came from Hopewell, New Jersey. Now that's the one up in Trenton, and they think that's why Hopewell Township down here is named what it is. He was known as speaking with real conviction, and he proposed that the congregation sign 9 articles of faith, and that's what we honor today for 275 years. So in the beginning, 18 members signed the articles of faith at a business meeting on March 27th, 1737. The best I can tell, that was a Wednesday. It is safe to assume, looking through it, that less than half of the congregation signed. So it wasn't that we only had 18 people in the church. So we look at who we are and who we were. Now we are the second oldest church in our denomination. However, we weren't the Shiloh church. We were known as Cohansey Church, which, if you know anything about the area, there already is a Cohansey church. A little confusing. And officially, we were known as the First Congregation of Seventh-day Baptists residing in Hopewell in the county of Cumberland, the state of New Jersey. Try writing a letter. Go ahead. 1738, Robert Ayres' sixth son. How many of you have six sons? Whew. Donated an acre of land right here that a church could be built on, because they were still going all the way over to Bowentown. That's a short drive, but a lot of them had to walk or ride a horse. And you imagine it was inclement weather, snow. It was not easy to do. So, there's a small frame church. Go ahead, you can turn to that, Lauren. That is supposed to be the actual church building. That was moved. It was turned into a barn. That's 1913. If you know anything later on how they moved this on logs, that's a fairly substantial building to have been moved down the road. Unfortunately, it was destroyed in a fire in the 1960s. So it lasted for well over 200 years. So, we continue to move on. Reverend Jonathan Davis retires in 1738. We need somebody to replace him. Well, who can replace Jonathan Davis? Well, enter Jonathan Davis. So let's go to the next one. Jonathan E. Davis becomes the pastor. He was ordained the year before on the last Sunday of November, because you did all that sort of thing on a Sunday, ordinations, weddings, baptisms, because you didn't do it on Sabbath day. He stayed 30 years and did sign the covenant. So in our first 3 decades, we had 60 individuals join the church by baptism. Our first, Jonathan Davis, passed away in 1746, and the next one in 1769. So, deja vu all over again. 1769, Jonathan Davis passes away. We need a new pastor. Who else but Jonathan Davis? Jonathan D. Davis. We're running out of middle initials. He was actually no relation to the first two. And ironically enough, he married Margaret Bond. So, 1771. Growing church needs space, and it decides it's time for a brick church. So, this is a picture of the brick church. The old frame church that I showed you is rolled down the highway. Well, it wasn't a highway at the time. It was rolled on logs and only made it as far as the corner. They had to stop because it was Friday, and the sun was going down, and Reverend Jonathan Davis, I'm not sure which one, he says, "The ark resteth at Shiloh," quoting the Bible. Hence, immediately we become Shiloh, New Jersey. Well, actually, it would take 50 years for it to become commonplace. But we did become Shiloh. We work on handsy corners. So, 1785, Jonathan Davis dies at 51. And his request, he is buried below the location where the pulpit was in the old frame church, out in the cemetery. And if you go out there, that's where it is. You can actually go out there in our cemetery, find the spot. You both know that's where the original church was and where one of the pastors is buried. This comes in real handy during lock-ins. I read that part from the history book, and then I say, let's go down in the basement, and the kids just don't want to go. So, all right. So to recap, I'm going to check ages with this one. This is my pastor, Jonathan Davis, and this is my other pastor, Jonathan Davis, and this is my other pastor, Jonathan Davis. If you don't get it, look at somebody who laughed and ask them after the service. All right. We've lost our 3 Jonathan Davises. It becomes a trying time for the church. Supply and demand. We go through 2 decades of supply pastors, lay preaching, and various doctrines being introduced. A couple of instances. Abner Cartwright withdraws from the church when it refuses to grant him permission to preach. And it took great reasoning to convince Philip Ayres that his qualifications were not the same that Paul gave directions for. So you see, a lot of people wanted to preach, and we tried to make sure only those that seemed qualified were able to. We also had the advent of universalism. Now, Universalism is a theological doctrine that all people will eventually be saved. Now, that doesn't mean that all people can't be saved, but it's a belief that everyone will be saved regardless. It gives a new meaning to that hymn. So, during the 1780s, Jonathan Jarman is suspended because of his universal doctrine, and I found this interesting because he took communion with First-day Baptists. Throughout the 1780s, members on both sides of the universalism argument were cited for intemperate language. So we might want to keep that in mind the next time we have a discussion, to watch our intemperate language. So, 1789, the church is split into two distinct groups, Universalists, non-Universalists. Disagreements break out about who can use the church when, because they were both still trying to meet here. And as arguments will do, it results in a lawsuit. And the ironic part is, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court of New Jersey in 1790 to resolve it. The kicker is, the Universalists won. So, why are we not a Universalist congregation to this day? Well, fortunately, calmer heads prevailed. The church reunites, and slowly universal doctrine goes away. All right, we've made it to the 1800s. Bear with me. So, 1800s dawns. The church is still using pulpit supply. We're recovering from the split. We're growing. We had so many people come back to the church in new baptisms. Seats are added to the sanctuary. All that we need is a full-time pastor. We need a new full-time pastor named... Close. John Davis. Close. Very happy-go-lucky sort of guy. He's the youngest son of Jonathan E. Davis, the third guy. Okay, all right. He serves 34 years. Church has about 170 members. 1820s. We had an office of 5 overseers that's formed to know any misconduct or unworthy living by members and to report it at the next business meeting. Okay, circa 1828. Sabbath school's organized. Kids would meet in the brick church. Boys on the west, girls on the east. 1830s, we have General Conference here at Shiloh, and the debate starts. This is something I found interesting. Debate at conference about when does Sabbath start? We probably thought that's always been the case. We always knew. Well, our own pastor, John Davis, and many members took the Roman method, which starts at midnight. But conference determined it would start Friday evening at sundown, and that's still what we practice. But many of the older ones continue to observe a Roman Sabbath. So, we got to watch those older ones in the congregation, I guess. So, 1840s. Pastor John Davis passed away. We have basically 2 to 3 year stints from a lot of pastors, and one of those is Solomon Carpenter. He becomes the first Seventh-day Baptist missionary to China. And if you go to the next display, that's him. And if you look right back here in the corner, that's the display. That's some of the artifacts he brought back. He brought those back from China. He's actually sent them back to us. So, all right, public education. 1848, Union Academy is founded by the Seventh-day Baptists. It's the first higher education school in South Jersey. Believe it or not, they called it a liberal education. Probably had a different meaning at the time. But had a liberal education, and they would use our church building through 1868. We can see a picture of the Shiloh School, and that was a bulletin they used to advertise it. Why were they able to use the old church? That's because 1850 we dedicated this building. It was a commodious and substantial brick church, and it cost all of $5,000. 1860s, I find ironic the Ladies' Benevolent Society forms a year before the Civil War would traumatize the nation. Over the next 75 years, Sabbath school teachers would meet at the church every Sunday to prepare lessons, kind of like we do now, right? Okay. 1868, Sabbath School presents the church with its first organs, despite opposition from the more conservative members. I found that interesting. Political causes. We were known as the Temperance Church. We stopped using wine for communion in 1879, and we formed the first women's Christian temperance union in the area in 1888. Touch on just a couple of the pastors during this time. Theodore Gardner was here for about 11 years, and the interesting part about him, he arrives, finds the church $2,000 in debt, and we're selling pews each year. You could rent your pew. So he makes the pews free. He starts an envelope offering system, and I found it interesting, he pledged to cover any shortfall in the budget to encourage the members to do this. Within 2 years, all debts, including our mortgage, paid. Talk about faith. So, 1880s, the church moves the upper room of Public School 35 from the corner property. That's right here. You have East Avenue, Walnut Street, the house right there. That's where the property was. That's where Ed Harris lives now. They took the second floor, plopped it down, moved it about as far as I would want to move it, and it became our memorial. It's what now is the Memorial Chapel, or where the fisherman class meets. And here's a picture from the turn of the century. You can see the church in the background, and that building, as it looks now, well, there's no fellowship hall or session room next to it. That's from about 1900. So